Hello, I am Ngamisile Pamela Ngubane, and this is the Entity Dynamics podcast. Today's episode is entitled Ubuntu as the Framework for the Creation of a National Culture. Entity Dynamics is a culture development consultancy. We believe that in order to change a society's reality, we need to change a society's culture. In other words, we believe that culture creates behavior and behavior creates reality. We work with civic and social organizations that wish to launch interventions into various communities. We help to direct the adaptation of certain aspects of the cultures of those communities to be in harmony with the cultures of the intervening organizations. This ensures that the communities are able to assimilate those interventions into the fabric of the life of those communities. This in turn ensures that the interventions will live on in the lives of the communities after the intervening organizations have moved on to their next projects. Since 1994, we have been called the Rainbow Nation and are supposedly, as our coat of arms says, diverse people united. But labels and mottos do not a culture make. And as I have said in the first episode, South Africa is in dire need of a culture makeover. And so in this episode, we will look at the cultural philosophy of Ubuntu and what role it can play in the development of a national culture. I believe that we need to formulate a national culture if we're going to have peace and accountability in our country. Ubuntu is a relevant and feasible foundation upon which we can base a national culture because it is recognized as a real cultural philosophy by all South Africans and is also the historic and in many cases the current cultural philosophy that Bantu South Africans, who make up 80% of the population of South Africa, live by. However, there are many issues with Ubuntu that must be overcome to make this proposition viable, and they will be discussed in this episode. As South Africans know, in many respects, Ubuntu has a latent effect on our culture. But while our government claims to have Ubuntu as the ethos that inspires its policies since the 1990s, it is clear that this is not the case. As we have pointed out in the previous episodes, it is socialism that is the spirit inspiring ANC policy, not Ubuntu. Ubuntu espouses the maxim of Umuntu ungumuntu ngabantu. Another less known but equally important maxim is Inkosi iyinkosi ngabantu. These maxims mean, respectively, a person becomes what he or she is through his or her relationships with other people, as well as through the influence of his or her society. And the other is a ruler through and depending on the acquiescence and goodwill of the people he or she rules. Inkosi is a ruler in isiZulu. Khosi in Setswana. I've come to the conclusion that these are profound observations, and they are observations that regulate behavior, these maxims. However, I don't believe that they are cultural content in themselves. They describe how society works. If you do this, then such and such will happen. The cultural inputs vary from Bantu social groups to Bantu social groups. Other social groups also have ways of describing how their societies work. The Bantu people who articulated the regulating observations explained above held that what is desirable in life is that people live in societies where group harmony is based on building consensus on how to achieve the best outcomes for the society or the group. Individuals are also important because the Bantu people understood that society is made up of individuals and that individuals could have a profound influence on the other individuals in society for good or for ill. They knew that forcing people to do things was counterproductive, and this is why consensus building is so important. Because when people participate in developing the society's cultural systems, there will be more harmony in society. When I speak of the latent effect of Ubuntu on our society, an example of this is the formation of the Congress of South African Trade Unions. COSATU is the biggest trade union federation in the world, I think, or maybe there's one in Brazil that's bigger, but it's one of, if not the biggest one in the world. And if you look at how it was created, it was literally 2 years of deliberations, consensus building, in order to come to the agreement to create this very big and actually pretty well organized trade union. So this is how we can see that the Ubuntu philosophy of consensus building or the Bantu philosophy of consensus building is a very important one in creating social cohesion and one which could help us in South Africa in creating this national culture. So harmony is important because when you have harmony, the group is made strong and is capable of pulling together when a threat arises. Through the process of consensus building, everyone had to agree that they all meant the same thing when they said certain words, like respect or duty, and that they meant the same things in espousing concepts such as doing your best, such as king, chief, or head clansman. They also agreed on what the different members of the social group were expected to do as members of the group, and what they could expect the group to do for them in terms of the roles they played and the positions they held in the group, socially, politically, and economically. With regards to Inkosi Ngabantu, without the acquiescence of his or her people to rule them, the rulers would find their authority undermined or even supplanted. This could also involve the diminishing of the ruler's domain. The ruler's job could be made very difficult if they lacked the people's goodwill. In the past, people would pack up and leave, and this would diminish the Nkosi's domain. This is because in the Bantu culture, every person is born with a right to land, because land is the basis of life. You needed to build a house, to grow food, to mine ore, to gather resources, etc. And there was also communal land with resources that people shared, like grasslands for grazing, rivers for gathering water, forests for timber. So when people would pack up and leave, how this decreased the ruler's dominion is that the departure of people meant they departed with their land or location. They would then settle with a new ruler, and their natural right to land would mean an allocation of land which would fall under the jurisdiction of the new ruler, thus increasing the dominion of the newly adopted ruler and decreasing the dominion of the ruler that had been abandoned. While there is a strong emphasis on promoting the well-being of the collective, private property was also respected. This is illustrated in rules regulating the movement of people's livestock, for example. If someone's livestock ate someone's crops, the offended person could claim compensation from the owner of the stray livestock, and also stealing livestock from others could be tantamount to a declaration of war. As I explained in the previous episode, the Bantu people of South Africa, as well as the Khoi and the San, had pre-literate and pre-industrial civilizations before the arrival of the European colonists. Therefore, being cut off from the land was being cut off from the only means of production they knew, and therefore, means being cut off from the means of sustaining life. This explains why the Native Land Act of 1913 was so painful for the Bantu people of South Africa, as well as the San and Khoi people, and also why the addition of 6% of land to the native reserves established by the 1913 Act, when the Act was amended in 1936, was essentially seen as an insult. Only a very small black elite was able to acquire Western education and thus enter new avenues of economic activity. It must be noted at this point that this history is not behind the ANC's insistence on the right of black people to take the land of white people today. Socialism is behind this. Going back to Amakhosi, the rulers. Today, people are still packing up and leaving when rulers are out of order. And while they may not diminish the ruler's land territory, it does diminish the human capital available to the rulers and to the state. This translates into less taxes, less contribution towards developing the field of work that the person leaving is engaged in the country. And when people don't leave, this diminishing of dominion translates into the diminishing of the votes the rulers get in their elections, as we have seen in the last two election cycles. Now, back to the observation that people influence each other. Unlike the Jewish and Christian worldview, the Bantu worldview has the idea that people are inherently good. Therefore, it is assumed that people will seek to do their best, to do well, because they want the best possible influence. They want to be the best possible influence on other people, and they want other people to be the best possible influence on themselves and on their children. The default setting in Bantu philosophy, therefore, is that people are good and must remain good and must be helped to remain good. This could explain why useless leaders in the various Bantu majority nations in sub-Saharan Africa post-colonialism have remained in power so long. The people believed they would self-correct. They thought their leaders' behavior and worldview were regulated and inspired by Ubuntu. They did not know anything about socialism. Before I go further, it is important that it be mentioned that Ubuntu was and is expressed primarily in and primarily for the good of the clan. Even a kingdom made Even in a kingdom made up of clans, the clan is the nucleus of the society. For the members of the society, loyalty to the clan comes first. Sometimes smaller clans would group together for mutual benefit. This clan loyalty is illustrated by the following example. In 1879, the British conquered the Zulu. They then began to establish a system through which they would administer the British Crown's newly acquired subjects. This period coincided with a rinderpest epidemic that swept through the cattle herds in that part of the country. Seeing that cattle were the source of wealth among the Zulu, the British sought to mitigate the effects of the epidemic by placing a limit on the number of cattle a family could require in lobola. Lobola is a dowry that the husband-to-be's family gives to the bride-to-be's family. And it's the bride-to-be's family that determines how much lobola they will require from the husband-to-be's family. So in this setting of limits, the British set the limits of cattle that could be requested as lobola to 9 cattle. The Zulu people immediately began to request that maximum number. Why? Because in Zulu culture, people don't marry within the clan. So I'm a Ngubane. I can't marry another Ngubane. I also can't marry someone who's related to my mother's family. Okay. So in that, it wasn't a problem to extract the maximum from another clan, because your idea is that you need to do what is good for your clan first and foremost, if not only. And this maximum extraction policy continues to this day. And as a result, many people are not getting married because they fear the inevitable debt they will fall into in having to provide the bride's family the inevitably high lobola that will be sought. This is another issue that really needs to be discussed. There are other Bantu groups that do permit intra-clan marriages, and I assume that they don't have the same issue with lobola requirements as I have described above. Things have changed drastically in South Africa since the British and the Afrikaans conquered this territory. Urbanization is one such major change. In the small social and cultural groups that Bantu people lived in pre-colonial societies, it was easy to insist that people do their best for the good of the group. They all agreed what their best meant, even beyond the clan and on more general matters, even within the kingdom, because that kingdom would have been a Zulu kingdom or a Xhosa kingdom or a Tswana kingdom, Even, it's quite complicated, but the Zulu are probably the most homogenous of the different kingdoms for various reasons. But nonetheless, within the language groups, cultural groups, people would have extended understandings, shared understandings of the various meanings of things. But what happens is when diversity increases in an area, this becomes a problem. So when you're living in the sprawling, multi-ethnic urban areas in South Africa, it's not so easy to use this model to regulate people's behavior. Within those small social groups, people shared a common culture and spoke not just a common language, but a common dialect of that language. Unspoken rules were naturally adhered to by the group. What is more, these unspoken rules were easily enforced, with the offenders willing to submit to the discipline meted out by the group. Unrepentant offenders were forced out of the group, and so maintaining order was not difficult. The Nguni and Sotho people have different languages and cultures, even though they're all Bantu peoples. And as Bantu peoples, they share an adherence to and a respect for the regulating observations of Ubuntu. However, they all have their own different meanings of what it means to do one's best, to be good, to show respect, also what a ruler should or shouldn't expect from the subjects or the citizens, and vice versa. It is on this basis of a lack of mutual agreement between South Africa's people on what values we actually share and should share that I come to the conclusion, that Ubuntu must be codified. If we are honestly going to use it as the basis upon which we build a national culture in South Africa, we need to come to an agreement on what we mean by certain words. It can't be up in the air because someone can just decide, I meant this. Unspoken rules don't work in a multi cultural society. As you can imagine, this will be a difficult undertaking, but it is precisely because Ubuntu is not codified that our unscrupulous government officials can claim to be behaving in line with the cultural guidelines of Ubuntu philosophy, because who knows what anything means. They know very well that the Bantu people hadn't written any of this down, and that there was no standard agreement between the various cultural groups in South Africa since 1994 on what to expect when the Ubuntu ethos was applied to civil service as claimed by the government. Therefore, while our rulers and other civil servants claim to be regulated by Ubuntu, it is not clear what they consider to be their best. They may say that the Constitution and various handbooks prescribe what their best should be, but how many times have they violated the same rules and regulations contained in these texts? There's also no way that texts can claim to be Ubuntu-based texts because there's no way that they can claim that these texts are Ubuntu-based texts because there was no national consensus behind their compilation. There wasn't. And if they were, we would see it because, first of all, it wouldn't be so easy to manipulate and ignore because the people would know what was in there. And, in this way, because the people knew, they would be much more capable and inclined to hold the leaders accountable to adhering to the spirit of the law that was set down through these texts, if they were indeed based on Ubuntu, which means consensus building. Within our society and civil servants, some people think that their best means doing 50% of their job. Some teachers think that their best means having intimate relationships with their students. Some church pastors think that their best means supplanting the Bible's moral philosophy with self-conceived personal development concepts. And some business people think that their best means lowering production standards in order to increase profits. Therefore, we have to come to an agreement on what doing one's best is. We have to agree on what we should expect from our civil servants and what they should expect from us. We have to agree on what we can expect from each other as fellow citizens. We also have to agree that we will base decisions about what the best values are in creating our national culture. We have to agree that these decisions will be based on objective reality, not on subjective preferences. We have to agree on how to treat the various people segments in our groups, in our society, like the disabled, the poor, and young people. In short, we need a code of conduct that we will use as the software through which the regulating observations of Ubuntu can regulate our society. We have many moral codes we can draw from, such as the Old and New Testament scriptures, other moral philosophies that uphold individual rights, the moral philosophies of Ubuntu, the Khoi and the San, and those of the other religious and social groups in South Africa. In this way, we can formulate standards of conduct we should adhere to, and Ubuntu can tell us whether we are doing our best to live up to those standards based on the effect that we have in practicing them and our effect in practicing them on the people around us, the positive effect. While I'm not advocating self-sacrifice, nor for some sort of morality police to be established, I do believe that Ubuntu emphasizes the practical application of one's worldview, shaping one's character. A good character would then birth good deeds and right conduct being displayed by the individual. The same would apply to the creation of a positive national character. Government policies would not benefit one social group at the expense of another. People would not find it impossible to start businesses or to get jobs. The education system would teach people how to take care of themselves, thus making them less dependent on the state for maintenance. Police would keep our citizens safe. The army would keep our borders functional. Civil servants would know that they have standards they must meet in doing their jobs. Beyond thinking that Ubuntu is the best vehicle for establishing this national culture, not only because it requires practical application and emphasizes acting on the moral philosophy one espouses, this process will draw in millions of Bantu as well as Khoi and San South Africans who live at this time under the rule of traditional authorities and who have never truly integrated into the fabric of the modern state of modern nation of South Africa. In the area administered by traditional leaders, the Amakosi, Ubuntu is the philosophy people live by. And by bringing them and their traditional authorities into the process of formulating this national culture, we end their marginalization. This marginalization leaves them vulnerable to exploitation by those very same traditional authorities in many cases, and it also leaves those traditional authorities vulnerable to exploitation by state authorities. Together, all of us as South Africans must come to agree on what values and beliefs will be expressed and upheld by this national culture. Because the people of South Africa are aware of and familiar with the moral philosophy of Ubuntu and its regulating observations, it makes it a valid framework for the construction of a national culture. It is important that we codify it, and based on this code, we begin to hold the influential members of our society responsible to internalize the importance of their behavior and their example to society, in particular, the civil servants. In this way, honesty will beget honesty, and self-reliance and self-responsibility will beget self-reliance and self-responsibility. But it starts with us agreeing on this code so that it can actually become a tool for us to hold each other accountable. Failing in our ability to achieve this as a way to establish a nation at peace with itself, I believe that the only other option is to revisit the concept of separate development. I will discuss this in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe. And please check me out on Twitter at Dynamic Entity 24 and on LinkedIn at Entity Dynamics. And hopefully we will chat in the comment section. Please leave your comments. I'd like to hear what you think, and see you next time. Thank you. Bye.